Hi, I'm Bill, and welcome to my 9th episode of Not Your Crazy Uncle, entitled, Does the Press Have a Liberal Agenda? The short of it is that I do have a one-word yes or no answer for you, I promise, but it's going to take me a couple of minutes to get there first. Throughout history, there's been times where the press has sensationalized the news to sell papers or attract viewers, but I'm going to consider that a separate issue. I want to talk specifically about having an agenda. And a good place to start is by asking if the press is biased. And the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Now, I believe there are two types of bias. One is the quality that we all share. We're going to present things in a way that we really believe in our heart of hearts is objective, when we're actually subjective, as things are biased by our own perceptions. It's just human nature. But when we consciously strive to influence others with our own bias, now that's a different story. I believe the press for many years was simply guilty of being human, and they unconsciously influenced the news. But at some point in time, I think that turned into a self-righteousness where they began swaying the news for what they saw as the greater good. Instead of objectively presenting what was real, they began presenting the news in a way that was striving to influence their beliefs on others. I believe we're at the point now where the news is so blatantly biased that it's nearly unwatchable. And it pains me to say this, but Republicans know exactly where I'm coming from. Because with the exception of Fox, the news is so blatantly pro-Democrat and anti-Republican that I don't know how it's not obvious to everyone. Now, if you're looking for motives here, I honestly don't know why the press is so blatantly Democrat. I just know that they are. And if you don't see this bias, I think it's kind of like an optical illusion where you can't see something at first, but then once you figure it out, you can never unsee it. Do you watch Fox News and see how it's blatantly pro-Republican? Well, try to turn the tables a little bit. Watch CNN or the evening news pretending to be a Republican and looking for bias. It won't take you long to find it. Now, the press became so brazen that in 2016, they didn't even try to hide their love affair with Hillary Clinton, first as she ran against Bernie Sanders and then against Donald Trump. And I believe this was the first time that the press suffered a backlash as Trump called them on their fake news. And most Trump supporters saw through the facade that the mainstream networks were doing in their coverage of Hillary. Ironically, Trump won by pointing out the fake news of the mainstream press, then went on to create a whole new level of fake news himself, highlighted by the allegations of the fraud in the 2020 presidential election. So now I could give you that one-word answer. Does the press have a liberal agenda? And the answer to that is no. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, you just went on to say how the press is so pro-Democrat and anti-Republican. Now you're saying they don't have a liberal agenda. What gives? And I think a lot of this is terminology. What does it mean to be liberal? What does it mean to be conservative? Those words have evolved in their meaning to the point now where I don't think they have any meaning at all, other than we associate Republicans with being conservative and liberals with being Democrat. But if you want to get down to it, the Democratic Party right now is not made up of liberals. I believe that the people who truly consider themselves liberals are not even part of the Democratic Party anymore. And the only reason they voted for Joseph Biden was to vote against Donald Trump. It's believed now that as many as 50% of the Generation Z members consider themselves to be Marxist. And that number seems to be growing. There's a large number of people who have moved to the left of the Democratic Party. Why don't you ever hear about them? If the press truly had a liberal agenda, wouldn't they be focusing on the people who are the most liberal? If the press is liberal or communist, shouldn't they be pumping up the interest in these causes? But it seems like they don't. You never hear about it on the news. The press here shows their bias with a bias of omission, not talking about anybody who they perceive might cost their Democratic darlings some votes. Don't believe me? When's the last time you heard a story about the Green Party or the Communist Party growing in our country? You don't. If you want to learn about progressives, you've got to look underground or on social media, because you're not going to see it on the evening news with David Muir. The press is even more guilty of their omission in their ignoring of the Libertarian Party, a party that's been on the ballot in all 50 states in 5 presidential elections, is basically a non-entity to the mainstream press, except for those occasional stories where they do something ridiculous. Do you even know who Gary Johnson is? Did you know he was a 2-time nominee for the Libertarian Party? If you ever did hear of him on the news, it was because of his blunder with Aleppo, not because of anything he stood for or any credibility as a candidate. Did you know that Jo Jorgensen was the Libertarian presidential candidate in 2020? Did you know that Jo Jorgensen was a woman? Do you think that maybe the second time a woman was the nominee in a presidential election that it would be newsworthy? Who was the first woman to receive an electoral vote as a vice presidential candidate? I'll bet you many would say Hillary, even though she never ran as a vice president. Old-timers might say Geraldine Ferraro, who was Walter Mondale's running mate in 1976. But we could do you one better in the Libertarian Party. Theodora Nathan and her running mate John Hospers received an electoral vote in the 1972 presidential election. That seems to me to be something historical worth mentioning in the press, but of course she's not Democrat, so it's not worth digging up. She was also the first Jewish person to receive an electoral vote. But again, she wasn't Democrat, so it's not worth talking about that either. While libertarians tend to be closer aligned to Republicans than Democrats, you might wonder, well, why doesn't the press push for libertarians so that we could steal votes from the Republican Party? Well, in the 2016 election, I think the press thought it was impossible to screw up. They thought if they could just keep building up Hillary while discrediting Trump, there was no way she could lose. And they didn't want to muddy the waters by talking about anyone else, especially not Green Party members, but even libertarians, because you never know what you're going to get. They're kind of the wild card in the whole thing, and we all knew Hillary couldn't lose anyway, right? Then in the 2020 election, it was all about beating Trump. And again, the press, they didn't learn their lesson from what they did in 2016. They, once again, in their arrogance, thought that they were going to spin this election. And in a sense, it worked, although I think Trump spun this election better than anyone into the favor of the Democrats. So we're just not going to mention the Libertarians. We'll ignore them, especially since they have a female candidate who might sway a couple of Democrats. So in summation, the press does not have a liberal bias. They have a pro-Democratic Party bias. And of course, we have Republicans who create fake news of their own. So what news can you trust? Who can you believe? What is real? What isn't real? I have to be honest, I really don't know. All I do know is that I am not your crazy uncle.